The example provided by Rashi to illustrate the fraud component was that the individual was advised, Mechor Sadachah, sell your field, and with the proceeds procure a donkey. The question that was asked was, if that be the case, why was there a need for Rashi to add the third line to the commentary, Viata Okef Allah? In addition to giving the bad advice, the problem here lay in the fact that there was also a vested interest, in that the one giving the advice intended to obtain ownership of the land. In the SICHAH, the Rebbe will propose two reasons as to why this explanation for the addition of that third line is flawed, hence rejected, and ultimately a better option needs to be provided for the inclusion of the vested interest component. Underpinning the argument as to why there was a need was that the advice to move from a farming source of income to one involving the purchase, transportation, and resale of goods was in of itself good advice, in that the return on one's efforts and investment from the buying and selling of merchandise is immediate, whereas in farming the return will not eventuate for many months, and in the meantime there was always the risk of catastrophic loss due to circumstances beyond the control of the farmer. However, as with everything in life, there are risks that very often come with the benefits. It could also be argued that there is an advantage in farming over that of buying and selling. It is to be assumed that in the world of small business, there was an obligation on the part of the individual to transport the merchandise from point A to point B. Until fairly recently, this involved a dependency upon an animal, for example, a donkey. The downside is that animals have a limited lifespan, in contrast to farming, where in the case of farming, the property, the land, remains in the possession of the farmer, until such time that he or she decides to sell the land for, in today's day and age, build apartment complexes. A second negative inherent in buying and selling is that the individual is constantly away from family. This was the situation where in many westernized countries we have the door-to-door salesman, and more recently individuals who have to leave home for extended periods of time to arrange for the purchase and resale of goods. So that in the example provided by Rashi, the actual sale of the land for the purchase of a donkey in of itself is not necessarily bad advice. The shortcoming here is that the advice was inappropriate for this particular individual. A point that can be demonstrated in the two other examples provided by the Torat Kohanim, which is the source for Rashi's commentary. Rising early in the morning to go to work, or Yetzeh B'Tzaharayim, returning in the late afternoon, in of itself is not bad advice. It becomes bad advice when there is a risk factor, such as that of robbery when one leaves before daybreak, or dehydration and exhaustion if one is traveling during the hottest part of the day. A point made by the Torat Kohanim and incorporated by Rashi in his commentary, Al Titein Lo Eitzah, one should not give advice that is She'ena Hogenet Lo, that is not appropriate for this individual. Existentially, there is no inappropriateness if it does not lead to negative outcomes. And hence a close reading of the Rashi lifted from the Torat Kohanim is Lo Titein Eitzah. Do not give advice. Eina hogenet law, that is inappropriate for that person. As such, the fact that there was also a vested interest component is immaterial and irrelevant. The violation of Torah law in the giving of advice that turns out to be detrimental to this individual. This point can be seen in the actual content of the Torat Kohanim, where following the three examples, the Torat Kohanim adds, Shema Toma, should one delude oneself, justifying that Eitzah Tova Ani Noten Lo, the advice that I gave, in other words leaving before daybreak or mid-afternoon, in of itself was good advice, and hence one should not be responsible for the negative outcomes. To this the Torat Kohanim adds, Harei Hadavar Masur Lelev, you will be held accountable not because of the advice, but because of the intent, as reflected in the concluding stanza of Vayikra 19:14, V'yareta me'elokecha ani Hashem. As noted, Rashi offers the same explanation, not as an extension to the prohibition of v'lifnei iver lo titein michshol, but rather as a standalone statement. Which brings us back to the original question, why has Rashi incorporated the vested interest component in his commentary to the prohibition and reinterpretation to v'lifnei iver lo titein michshol?